When I saw my husband leaning against the garage doorway, arms folded, looking at me with that frozen expression on his face, my stomach turned in a way I hadn't felt since I was a teenager caught sneaking in after curfew. But this wasn't teenage rebellion. This was something worse. He wasn't shouting. He wasn't asking questions. He was just standing there, watching. And I knew then that it wasn't the watching that scared me. It was the not knowing what he had already seen. My first thought wasn't even fear, it was calculation. What had he figured out? Did he find something? Did he hear something? Or worse, had someone told him? I wiped my hands on my jeans, trying to act normal, like nothing in the world was off. But my knees were weak. My throat was dry. I could hear the old fan humming inside the garage, the smell of oil clinging to the air. I tried to speak, to offer something casual, something that could pass as everyday small talk. But before I could, he pulled out his phone. Unlocked it. Tapped the screen. Turned it toward me. A frozen frame from a security camera. Our car. Parked in the old gravel driveway behind the Smith's tool shed. And there, too small to be clear, but unmistakably me, standing next to it. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. My breath caught. I looked at the photo, then at his face. His jaw twitched. His knuckles whitened around the edges of the phone. I felt my chest tighten, not because I had been caught, but because I didn't know how long he had been holding this knowledge inside him. How many nights had he lain beside me, staring at the ceiling, wondering what kind of woman he was sleeping next to? I opened my mouth to speak, but nothing came. Nothing that would make sense. And in that silence, I realized something. This wasn't the moment it all began. This was the moment it all ended. But before I tell you how it unraveled, let me tell you how it all started. The truth, not the gossip, not the rumor, not the cropped screenshot in a neighbor's group chat. But what really happened. What I felt. What I ignored. What I let grow in the silence between one breath and the next. But before that, tell me in the comments below, have you ever kept a secret so big, so deeply buried, that even when it started to rot, you convinced yourself it smelled like roses? The mornings in our house always start the same, him pouring black coffee into his thermos, me folding last night's laundry with the TV humming some old rerun in the background. Our conversations, if they even qualify as that, are soft echoes of routine. Did you feed the dog? What time is your meeting? I'll be home late, don't wait up. I used to believe that this silence was peace. That the absence of fighting meant we were strong. Stable. Grown-ups who'd weathered life's storms and came out together. But somewhere in the quiet, I had stopped feeling like I was being loved and started feeling like I was being tolerated. Like I had slowly become part of the furniture, reliable, used daily, but never really noticed. He's not cruel. He doesn't yell. He doesn't cheat. He brings home groceries and takes out the trash and remembers to pay the taxes. And maybe that's what made it worse. There was no dramatic reason to feel unhappy. Just erosion. A slow crumbling of warmth. That morning, I noticed the sunlight spilling through the kitchen window, hitting my face in a way that highlighted every fine line. I ran my fingers down my cheek and wondered when exactly I'd stopped wearing lipstick. I reached for the tube buried in the drawer, the one I hadn't touched in months, maybe longer. Dust on the cap. A color I used to love. He didn't notice it when he came back through the kitchen. Not the lipstick, not the blouse I hadn't worn in ages. He just grabbed his keys and said he'd be at the garage with Ben, his friend since high school, the man who practically lived in that metal box out back with a wrench in hand and country music playing from a battered radio. Ben. Of course, it had to be him. I don't remember deciding to walk over to the garage that day. Maybe it was because I wanted to feel the sun. Maybe I just wanted to stretch my legs. Or maybe it was because something in me was tired of feeling invisible. He didn't hear me approach. His back was to me, bent over the open hood of a car, grease staining the arms of his shirt. The smell hit me before the sight: rubber, oil, and a hint of tobacco. A scent I used to associate with hard work. Now, it made me feel awake. He looked up and smiled. "You lose something?" he asked, wiping his hands on a rag. "No," I said. "Just passing through." But I wasn't. I stayed. I watched him work. Asked about the engine. Pretended to be interested in spark plugs and filters. He humored me, probably thinking I was bored. And maybe I was. Maybe I still am. He told a joke, something silly about husbands and remote controls, and I laughed. It wasn't even funny. But it felt good to laugh, especially when he laughed with me, not at me. Not absent-mindedly. Not distracted. He looked straight at me, like he really saw me. Not the woman who folded socks and picked up dry cleaning, but the woman who still had fire beneath the routine. I left after a while, my heart beating faster than it had in weeks. At home, the dishes waited. The laundry pile had grown. My husband was already in his recliner, eyes half closed, a sports recap flickering on the screen. "Did you go somewhere?" he asked. "No. Just stepped outside," I replied. He nodded and went back to the TV. That night in bed, I turned away from him. Not because I was angry. Not because I wanted to make a point. But because I didn't want him to feel the racing in my chest. I didn't want him to hear how alive I suddenly felt. I stared at the wall, unsure if what I'd felt was real or imagined. But I knew one thing. Ben had looked at me differently. And I had let him. Not because I was starved for attention, but because I had forgotten what it felt like to be noticed. And once you remember that feeling, it becomes very hard to let it go. It was a Thursday. I remember that clearly because it was garbage day, and I had forgotten to wheel the bin out the night before. I was still in my robe when I heard the truck growling down the street, and I rushed out with the wheels squeaking behind me, embarrassed, breathless. That mundane little panic set the tone for the morning, rushed, unfocused, a little off. He was already in the garage when I passed by again, an hour later. I had thrown on a cardigan and some jeans that used to sit better on my hips, but I didn't care. Or rather, I cared too much. There was no reason for me to go there. Not really. I told myself I wanted to ask about the noise our car had been making, some soft knocking I'd started imagining last week. But the truth was simpler, I just wanted to see him again. The door to the garage was open, and he was under the hood of a small blue hatchback I didn't recognize. The radio played low, old songs, the kind you forget you know until the lyrics fall back into place like muscle memory. He looked up when he heard me. "Back again?" he asked, his tone casual, almost teasing. I thought I heard something weird with the car. "That knocking sound is back." He wiped his hands on a rag and nodded. "Could be a dozen things. Want me to take a look?" He knew I wasn't really here for that. And I think I knew he knew. But we both pretended, because pretending gave us something to stand on. A shaky kind of safety. He leaned into the driver's side and turned the ignition. The engine coughed, rattled, and settled. He listened. I watched. Watched the way his arms moved, the small line of sweat darkening the back of his shirt, the way his focus never drifted. He was alive in a way that drew attention without trying. "There it is," he said. "You hear that rattle?" I nodded, even though I didn't. He shut off the engine and stepped back, rubbing his jaw. "Probably just a loose mount. Easy fix." I appreciate it, I said, and then, without meaning to, it's nice having someone who notices things. He looked up at me sharply. Not offended, not amused. Just listening. What do you mean? He asked. I opened my mouth, but nothing came out. The words I wanted weren't ready. So I shrugged. Forget it. I didn't mean anything. But I had meant something. And I think he knew that too. We stood there for a moment, the silence between us not uncomfortable, just thick. Heavy with all the unsaid things. I looked down at the floor, at the smudge of oil on my shoe. He stepped forward, only a little. Close enough that I could feel the warmth of his body. The air shifted. I don't want to make you uncomfortable, he said, his voice low, serious now. You're not, I answered. Too quickly. Too honestly. And then it happened. We kissed. It wasn't planned. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't come with a swell of music or a bolt of lightning. It was quiet, tentative, a moment that unfolded like something remembered rather than discovered. His lips were warm, his hands never moved. He didn't pull me in, and I didn't lean too far forward. It was just a kiss. But it unraveled something in me. When it ended, we didn't say anything. I stepped back, blinking. My mouth opened, but again, nothing came. A flush crept up my neck, and I felt both weightless and ashamed. I should go, I said. Yeah, he replied. I walked out into the sunlight. My legs felt unsteady. My breath was shallow. At the front door, I hesitated with my hand on the knob. Everything around me looked the same porch swing, same potted plants, same wind chimes tapping against the siding. But inside me, something had shifted. I made lunch like usual. He didn't come in. I didn't expect him to. I didn't even know if I wanted him to. My hands moved on autopilot, spreading butter on toast, slicing tomatoes, boiling water. My mind, however, raced. Not with guilt exactly, but with confusion. I didn't know what to do with what had happened. It wasn't a betrayal. Not yet. Not in the way people meant it. But it wasn't nothing either. When my husband came home that evening, he kissed me on the cheek, asked how my day was, and settled into his recliner. I stood in the kitchen and watched him, really watched him. He had a little smear of grease near his collar, probably from something at work. He hadn't shaved. His eyes looked tired. Did you talk to Ben today? I asked. He looked over. Yeah, he stopped by. Fixed the car. Oh. I tried to sound casual. Did he say anything? He frowned, thinking. Just that it was a loose mount. Said it should be good now. I nodded. That's good. He turned back to the TV. The conversation was over. That night, I lay awake beside him, staring at the ceiling. My heart didn't race like it had earlier. Instead, it beat with a slow, steady ache. I thought about the kiss, not the sensation of it, but what it meant. I thought about how easily I had let it happen. And how badly I had needed it. But more than anything, I thought about the silence. The kind that builds up over years, brick by brick, until it walls you off even from the people sleeping inches away from you. I wondered how long I had been building that wall. How long he had been building his. And how we had both ended up on opposite sides without even realizing it. And then I thought about tomorrow. Because I knew I'd walk past that garage again. And I knew I wouldn't just be passing by. I avoided the garage for 3 days. It doesn't sound like much, but when you live in a house where time moves slowly, where meals are eaten in silence and footsteps echo louder than conversations, 3 days can stretch like weeks. I stayed inside, filling time with small, repetitive tasks. I cleaned drawers that didn't need cleaning. I rearranged bookshelves no one looked at. I found myself folding already folded laundry just to feel busy. But distraction is a weak shield. Especially when your mind keeps returning to the same moment over and over again, replaying it from every angle, what I said, what I didn't, the pause between us, the warmth of the air, the way I hadn't regretted it in the moment. It wasn't guilt I felt. Not exactly. It was unrest. A quiet storm building in my chest that had nowhere to go. I kept looking out the window, past the hydrangeas and rose bushes, to the tin roof of the garage. I knew he was in there. I could hear the occasional clang of metal, the buzz of the electric screwdriver, the scrape of tires on the concrete floor. Sounds that had once blended into the background now pulled at me with quiet insistence. On the fourth day, I walked outside holding a basket of towels. That was my excuse. I took the long way to the clothesline, past the side fence, closer to the garage than necessary. I didn't expect to see him. But I think part of me hoped I would. He was standing near the open bay door, polishing the hood of a car. His movements were slow, methodical. He didn't look up right away. I turned slightly, pretending to adjust the basket against my hip, but I knew he'd seen me. There was a stillness in the way he paused, the kind of stillness that happens when two people know they're about to speak but haven't decided who will go first. I said nothing. Just kept walking. But I felt it, his eyes on me, the weight of the unspoken stretching between us like a taut wire. Later that afternoon, as I watered the front garden, he walked up the driveway toward our porch. My heart skipped. My hand froze on the hose. He raised a hand in greeting, casual, but his expression was careful. Measured. He said he'd left a wrench in the back and needed to grab it. I nodded too quickly, stepping aside to let him pass. I didn't offer to go with him. I didn't ask questions. I just stood there, listening to the rhythm of his steps fade behind the house. When he came back around a few minutes later, he stopped in front of me. Not too close. Just enough that I could smell the faint scent of oil and pine soap on his skin. I didn't mean for that to happen, he said, voice quiet. I hesitated. I know. He looked down, rubbing the back of his neck, then looked at me again. But I don't regret it. My breath caught, just slightly. Not from shock, but from how deeply the words landed. I looked at him, really looked at him, creased lines around his eyes, weathered skin, tiredness behind his gaze. He wasn't someone looking for trouble. He was someone who had simply felt something. And said it out loud. I haven't either, I said. He gave the smallest nod. Then, after a second, he stepped back and left. That night, I didn't sleep well. My body lay still, but my mind was restless. Every movement of the bedsheet sounded louder than usual. My husband stirred beside me once, murmured something in his sleep, then turned the other way. I stared at the ceiling, arms folded across my stomach, listening to the soft tick of the clock on the wall. The next morning brought no clarity. Only more quiet. More pretending. My husband left early. Said he had a meeting across town and might be late. I nodded, said I'd make dinner. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. With the house empty, I cleaned the counters 3 times. I opened windows even though it wasn't warm. I stood in the kitchen, trying to convince myself that nothing had changed. That it was just a kiss. That people make mistakes. That this could all be forgotten. But I didn't want to forget it. I walked outside. My feet moved on their own. Past the porch, down the side steps, through the patch of gravel and toward the open garage. He was there. This time, I didn't speak. I leaned against the frame of the open door, arms crossed. He looked up, tools in hand, and studied me for a second. "Did something break again?" he asked, half smiling. No, I took a breath. I needed to not be in the house. He nodded, setting the wrench aside. The garage was warm, the air thick with the scent of grease and dust and something older, like history. It was quieter than I expected. No radio today. No humming tools. He picked up a rag, wiped his hands, then leaned back against the counter. "Me too," he said. I needed to not be anywhere else. We didn't talk much after that. Just shared the space. I watched him work. He didn't offer me small tasks, like before. He didn't need to. I wasn't pretending to be curious this time. As I turned to leave, he stopped me. Not with words, but with a glance. One that held something unspoken. Gratitude. Sadness. Maybe even hope. I walked back to the house with my hands deep in my pockets, the wind tugging lightly at my sleeves. I knew I had crossed a line that wouldn't fade just because I wanted it to. I wasn't someone who lied easily. And yet, here I was, crafting silences, dodging truths, letting days drift into something I couldn't fully name. But the hardest part wasn't the lie. It was how right the truth had felt. The days began to shift subtly after that. Not in grand, cinematic ways, there were no sudden confessions, no dramatic glances across dinner tables, but in the rhythm of things. In the way my mornings felt heavier and my afternoons more expectant. I moved through the house like someone waiting for something unnamed, like someone listening for a knock that might or might not come. My husband remained unchanged. He rose early, showered, dressed in the same beige shirts and denim jeans, poured the same black coffee into the same dented travel mug. He greeted me with the same low, tired voice, and left behind the same faint smell of soap and exhaust. Nothing in him seemed aware. Or maybe he was simply unwilling to see what had become of us. I watched him sometimes, watched the curve of his shoulders as he bent over the sink, the way his keys jingled as he pulled them from the hook. There had been a time when those little things made me feel safe. Now, they made me feel distant. Like I was watching someone I used to know from across a glass wall. And yet, guilt didn't consume me. That's the part one hadn't expected. I thought I'd be haunted. I thought I'd lie awake with shame crawling up my spine. But instead, I felt restless. Like I was caught between two truths, either of which I could fully own. I avoided the garage for a few more days, not out of discipline, but because I wasn't ready for what might happen if I didn't. I kept my hands busy in the yard, pulling weeds that didn't need pulling, scrubbing bird droppings off the mailbox. My movements became smaller, tighter. I spoke less, to everyone. The silence grew thicker, and I wasn't sure whose it was anymore, mine or his. It was late afternoon when the car broke down. Not ours. A neighbor's. I saw them outside, gesturing toward the hood, frustration carved into their brows. And before I even thought about what I was doing, I was walking toward the fence, saying something about how Ben might be able to help. He came over without hesitation. The neighbor was grateful, and I stood there awkwardly, pretending to be just another helpful resident. But when he looked at me, there was something in his expression, softness maybe, or worry, or understanding. I didn't look away. Later that evening, after the neighbor had driven off and the sun had dipped low enough to cast everything in bronze, I found myself walking toward the garage. It felt unplanned, and maybe it was. My feet took me there before my mind caught up. He was alone, wiping his hands on a rag, the last light catching in the gray at his temples. The radio was off again. The air smelled like heat and metal. "I didn't know if you'd come," he said without turning. I didn't answer right away. I stepped inside, letting the scent settle around me, letting the door creak shut behind. I wasn't sure either, I said. He looked at me then, tired but clear-eyed. There was no smile, no flirtation. Just a long pause before he turned and picked up a small box of bolts, arranging them slowly on the workbench. I think about it, he said. More than I probably should. Me too. It wasn't much, but it was enough. We stood there in the quiet, the kind of quiet that comes from understanding, not awkwardness. I traced the edge of a tool on the bench with my fingertip, aware of every sound, my breath, the tick of the old wall clock, a bird calling somewhere beyond the trees. I don't know what this is, I finally said. He nodded. Neither do I. And maybe that was the truth I needed to hear. Not a plan. Not a label. Just the acknowledgement that something real had happened, something neither of us had asked for but couldn't seem to ignore. I left before it got dark. The air outside had cooled, and I walked home with my arms crossed against the breeze, head slightly down. There was no one to see me, no one to question where I'd been. My husband was in the kitchen, scrolling through his phone, waiting for the oven timer to beep. He asked if I wanted tea. I said yes. We sat across from each other in the living room, cups in hand, the television playing softly. He told me about a colleague's retirement. I nodded. I tried to listen. But inside, I was elsewhere, caught in a loop of thoughts that didn't settle. That night, when I undressed for bed, I stood a little longer in front of the mirror. I noticed the curve of my collarbone, the way the light brushed against the side of my face. I touched the small line above my brow, the one that always deepened when I was lost in thought. I didn't feel younger. I didn't feel prettier. But I felt more present. As if, for the first time in a long while, I was fully inhabiting my body. The next morning, I chose a blouse I hadn't worn in months. It wasn't revealing. It wasn't even new. But it was soft against my skin, and I liked the way it moved when I walked. My husband didn't notice. Or if he did, he didn't say anything. I stepped outside with a vague purpose, something about getting more basil from the garden, and again, my path veered toward the garage. This time, he wasn't there. The doors were open, the space empty except for tools left mid-task. I stood at the threshold for a moment, unsure whether to wait or leave. Then I saw the note, folded neatly on the corner of the workbench. My name wasn't on it, but it was clearly left for me. I opened it slowly. It was only one sentence. I'll be at the old tool shed behind the Smiths tonight, if you need air. No signature. No pressure. Just a place. Just a time. And an understanding. I folded the paper, slipped it into my pocket, and walked back to the house. The basil could wait. It rained the day I decided to go. Not a heavy rain, just that soft, steady kind that makes the world feel like it's covered in a damp hush. The sky had been gray since morning, and everything seemed slower than usual. The cars on the road moved cautiously. The wind barely stirred the trees. Even the birds seemed to have gone quiet, taking shelter in their nests. The kind of weather that asks you to stay home, to stay still. But stillness was the last thing I wanted. I had carried the note around with me all day. Not in my purse, not in my wallet, just in my pocket, where I could feel it with every step. It had become like a pulse against my leg, a silent question I couldn't ignore. The hours passed in slow motion. I folded towels that didn't need folding. I stared out the window at the street, watched water pool in the cracks of the sidewalk. My husband called around lunch to say he'd be home late, some last-minute issue at work. I told him to take his time. My voice sounded calm. My heart was not. As the light began to fade, I changed clothes twice. Nothing special. Just something simple, clean, dry. A jacket I hadn't worn in months, its pockets deep and familiar. I checked my reflection briefly, not to admire, not to impress. Just to confirm I still looked like myself. Or at least the version of myself I had grown used to. I didn't tell anyone I was leaving. I didn't leave a note. I just walked out the back door, past the rose bushes and the empty garden beds, past the gravel strip and toward the side path that ran along the Smiths' property. The rain tapped lightly on the brim of my hood. The sky was a sheet of dull silver. The air smelled like wet leaves and old wood. The shed was tucked behind a small cluster of trees, barely visible from the road. It wasn't much, a rectangular shape with a slanted roof, long since weathered, its red paint faded to the color of dried clay. I hadn't been back there in years. It used to be where neighborhood kids would stash their bikes or dare each other to go inside after dark. Now, it stood quiet and forgotten, a leftover piece of someone else's past. The door was cracked open. Inside, a faint light glowed from a single battery lantern resting on a shelf. He was there, leaning against the wall, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. He didn't speak when I entered. Neither did I. The space smelled like dust and wood rot and something faintly metallic. There were old tools scattered on a table, a broken lawn chair leaning in the corner, a blanket folded neatly on the floor like a quiet offering. The sound of rain on the roof was soft, rhythmic, steady. I stood near the door for a moment, letting my eyes adjust, letting the air settle around me. Then I stepped inside fully and closed it behind me. He shifted slightly but didn't come closer. "I didn't think you would," he said quietly. "I almost didn't," I replied. He nodded once, as if that made perfect sense. We stood there, not quite facing each other, not quite looking away. The silence was full, but not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that only exists when two people have already said everything important without using words. I walked over to the old shelf and ran my fingers across its edge, brushing away a thin layer of dust. The lantern flickered slightly. Outside, the wind picked up for a moment, then faded again. "This place hasn't changed," I said. "No," he answered. "But we have." The words hung between us. "Honest. There." He stepped forward slowly, not closing the space entirely, but narrowing it. I looked up at him, his face drawn and tired, but calm. There was no urgency in his expression. No demand. Just presence. I took a breath. The kind that comes from the center of your chest, heavy and real. "We kissed," I said. "And I haven't stopped thinking about it." He didn't move. Didn't interrupt. Just let me speak. "It wasn't a mistake," I continued. "But it was a choice. And I don't know what it means. I don't know what happens next. I'm not here with answers." "I didn't ask for any," he said. "I'm not looking for a plan." That gave me more comfort than I expected. We stayed there a while, just listening to the rain, to the creaks of the old structure settling in the cold. My hands were in my jacket pockets, his hung loosely at his sides. There was something grounding about it, being in a place so ordinary, so forgotten, and yet feeling more alive than I had in years. After a time, I moved to sit on the folded blanket. The floor beneath it was hard, but I didn't care. He sat too, across from me, our backs to the wall, knees nearly touching. We didn't need to fill the space with conversation. The silence between us was enough. I told him about the way I felt invisible some days. About how I had learned to stop expecting compliments, or glances, or touches that weren't routine. I told him how I had convinced myself for years that this was just what marriage looked like after a while, that contentment was supposed to be enough. He listened. Not the kind of listening where someone waits for their turn to speak. Real listening. The kind where you feel seen. He shared pieces of himself, too, not stories, not anecdotes, but small truths. The weight of loyalty, the ache of knowing when something has shifted and not knowing what to do with that knowledge. The fear of hurting someone you still care about. The fear of becoming someone you no longer recognize. I don't know how much time passed. An hour, maybe more. But at some point, the rain began to slow. The tapping on the roof faded. The air grew colder. He offered me his jacket. I refused, but smiled at the gesture. When I finally stood to leave, he did too. We didn't hug. We didn't reach for each other. We didn't need to. We'll see each other soon, he said simply. I nodded. Yes. And I walked back through the wet grass, down the quiet path, and back into the dim light of my home. That night, I didn't sleep. But it wasn't restlessness. It was something else. A quiet awareness that nothing would ever quite return to how it was. And that maybe, in some deep part of me, I didn't want it to. The morning after the shed felt quiet in a different way. Not the regular hush of routine, but something quieter inside me, like a knot that had finally loosened after being pulled too tight for too long. My husband was already gone by the time I woke. His thermos sat rinsed on the counter, a small note beside it reminding me to pick up something from the store. His handwriting was slanted, rushed, but familiar. I stared at the note for a long time, not reading the words, just absorbing the shape of them. Outside, the sky was clear again, washed clean by the night's rain. The backyard glistened under the early sun, and I stood at the window, holding my mug of tea, watching the way light moved across the grass. It should have been an ordinary day. It wasn't. I kept to the house for most of the morning, moving slowly from task to task, not because I had anything pressing to do, but because my body needed motion. I swept floors that were already clean, rearranged the spice rack, opened windows, and then closed them again. It wasn't anxiety. It wasn't guilt. It was something else. A sense of transition. As if I was standing in a doorway between one life and the next. By late afternoon, I found myself walking toward the garage. I didn't mean to. I told myself I was going to check on the car, or maybe ask about the noise it had made weeks ago. But really, I was just following the quiet thread that had been pulling me toward him all day. He was there, as I expected, bent over a workbench, sorting bolts and screws into small plastic trays. His movements were calm, deliberate. He didn't look up when I entered, but I knew he knew I was there. I leaned against the door frame, letting my fingers trail along the chipped edge of the wood. The air inside smelled like metal and dust and faintly of citrus hand cleaner. That scent was becoming familiar, grounding in a way I hadn't anticipated. For a long moment, neither of us said anything. I just watched him work, and he let me. Then, quietly, he said, "I'm leaving town for a few days." The words struck harder than I expected. I stood a little straighter. "Oh," I said. "For what?" He didn't stop sorting. "My brother's truck broke down. He's a few hours south. Needs help getting it back up." I nodded, even though he wasn't looking. "That makes sense." He glanced up then, finally meeting my eyes. There was something softer in his face, less guarded than usual. "I just thought you should know," he said. "Didn't want you to think I disappeared." I didn't know what to say to that. So I said the only thing I could. "Thank you." He nodded once and returned to his sorting. I stood there for another minute, then turned and left without saying anything more. As I walked back across the lawn, I realized I hadn't asked when he'd be back. The days that followed were slow, drawn out like a thread unraveling one loop at a time. I found myself watching the clock more often, checking the driveway, pausing when I heard any engine nearby. I told myself it was foolish, childish even, but the silence he left behind had weight. My husband didn't notice the shift. Or if he did, he didn't name it. He remained the same, quiet in the evenings, focused on news updates and weather forecasts, grocery lists and work emails. We sat at the same dinner table, shared the same meals, brushed teeth side by side in the same mirror. And yet, it felt like I was occupying two parallel lives, one visible, one private. It was during those days of waiting that something strange began to happen. I started remembering pieces of myself I'd forgotten. I began to see the way I'd disappeared inside comfort and routine, inside obligation and quiet compromise. I began to question how much of my silence had been chosen, and how much had been handed to me and accepted out of habit. I remembered how I used to laugh, really laugh. How I used to dress not just to look presentable, but to feel alive. I remembered how I used to dance in the kitchen while cooking, hum songs under my breath while doing laundry, sing in the car with the windows down. None of that had disappeared all at once. It had happened gradually. Piece by piece. And maybe that's why everything with him felt so different. Not because it was forbidden. Not because it was secret. But because it was real. Because it woke something in me that I hadn't realized was asleep. On the third day, I went to the grocery store alone. The aisles were mostly empty, the soft hum of refrigeration units echoing faintly between shelves. I moved slowly, not because I didn't know what to buy, but because I liked the solitude. I liked the space to think. As I turned into the next aisle, I saw a familiar figure near the produce section, our neighbor from across the street. The one who always trimmed his hedges too early in the morning. He smiled and waved, and I returned the gesture, but something in his eyes lingered too long. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just coincidence, just the awkwardness of small-town familiarity. But later, as I stood at the checkout counter, I noticed it again. A glance. A pause. The sense that someone was trying to remember something about me. That night, after dinner, I sat on the porch while my husband watched TV. The air was warm, still carrying a trace of summer despite the approaching autumn. I sipped tea slowly, listening to the quiet hum of insects in the distance. My phone buzzed once. It was a message from him. Back in town. Tomorrow. Just that. No greeting, no signature, no assumptions. And yet, it held more than any paragraph could. I didn't reply. Not because I didn't want to, but because I needed to sit with the feeling of what those 4 words meant. I needed to feel them settle. That night, I stood in the shower longer than usual, letting the water wash over me, letting my thoughts drift. Tomorrow. 1 word. And with it, 1,000 new choices. The morning light came in slow, golden through the slats of the blinds, stretching across the bed like a soft invitation. I lay still, eyes open, listening to the quiet murmur of the house. My husband had already left. His side of the bed was cold, sheets tugged, pillow dented. The same routines. The same silence. The same space between us, grown so large it felt like its own presence now. I moved carefully, as if noise might shatter something I didn't yet understand. There was no urgency in my movements, no clock to chase. I showered, got dressed, pulled my hair back, and put on makeup, not much, just enough to remind myself that I still had a face that was worth seeing. The rest of the day passed in a fog. I made phone calls, wiped down the counters, opened the windows for air. Every task was a way to measure the minutes until dusk. I didn't hear from him again. He didn't follow up, didn't ask questions. That restraint, that quiet respect, made me feel something I couldn't name. By early evening, I found myself pacing the kitchen floor, then stopping to rest my hands on the counter. I stared at the reflection in the window, my own eyes watching me, steady, uncertain. The light outside had softened, the sky painted in layers of lavender and amber. I left a note on the table for my husband. Just a simple message, went for a walk. Don't wait up. He wouldn't question it. He rarely did. The freedom of that indifference was a strange kind of pain. I walked through the neighborhood with my hands in my pockets, past trimmed lawns and glowing porch lights, past families sitting down for dinner. The world felt peaceful, like it had no idea what was happening inside me. Or maybe it did, and didn't care. The tool shed behind the Smiths was darker than before. The lantern was already lit inside, casting a warm, low circle of light on the floor and walls. The door was cracked open, just enough to see the shape of him standing near the back. I stepped in slowly, closing the door behind me. The air was cooler than I expected, the scent of wood and damp earth wrapping around us like a familiar coat. He turned to face me, his expression unreadable at first. Then he softened. Not with a smile, just with stillness. The kind that comes from being exactly where you meant to be. I didn't speak. Neither did he. We stood there for a moment, suspended in quiet understanding. The light flickered as the wind pressed against the walls, and I felt the weight of every moment that had led to this one settle deep in my chest. And then, we moved. No rush. No hunger. Just closeness. We sat down on the blanket again, knees touching, bodies angled inward. It wasn't a decision. It was a continuation. An unfolding of what had already begun, long before either of us admitted it. We didn't talk. There was nothing left to say that words could improve. The silence was more intimate than sound, the proximity more honest than confession. Time became shapeless. There was no ticking clock, no deadline, only the warmth between us, the softness of fabric under our hands, the steady breath that slowed in unison. I closed my eyes for a moment, not to escape, but to feel. And when I opened them again, he was still there. We spent the night together. There's no better way to say it. No need to say more. When I woke the next morning, the shed was quiet. The lantern had gone out. Pale light filtered through a crack in the boards. He was still sleeping beside me, his face turned slightly toward the wall, breath deep and steady. I watched him for a while, studying the peaceful lines of his brow, the way his hand rested near mine without touching. There was no tension in him, no worry. I rose gently, careful not to wake him. My joints ached slightly from the cold floor, but I didn't mind. I gathered myself slowly, quietly, adjusting my jacket, smoothing my hair. The stillness of the space wrapped around me, not suffocating but holding, like a pause before the next breath. As I stepped out into the early morning, the world was still soft. Mist clung to the grass. A bird called out, lonely and low. I walked back along the side path, head down, hands cold in my pockets. Back at the house, the kitchen smelled like toast. My husband stood at the counter, reading something on his phone. He looked up when I entered, nodded once, and went back to the screen. I mumbled something about walking early, about clearing my head. He didn't ask for more. I went upstairs and changed clothes, stood under the shower until the chill faded from my skin. I wrapped myself in a robe and sat on the edge of the bed, staring at nothing. I didn't cry. I didn't smile. I didn't regret. What I felt was more complicated than any single word. It was part peace, part grief. Part fear, part fullness. What happens next, I thought, isn't something I can plan. But I know this. Something has changed. And I can't pretend it hasn't. The days that followed unfolded like paper left out in the rain, soft at the edges, edges curling in on themselves, the ink of daily life beginning to smudge. Nothing drastic happened. No doors slammed. No accusations flew through the house. But beneath the quiet surface, something had cracked. And even if no one else noticed, I did. I felt it every time I looked at him. Every time I looked at myself. Routine resumed. Or at least, it performed the illusion of resuming. Breakfasts were made. Dishes were done. The same clothes were washed and folded. But I moved through those tasks like a person watching herself from a few feet behind. There was a distance between who I was and what I was doing. Like my hands were acting on old instructions while my mind rewrote something entirely new. He didn't message me. Not the next day, not the one after. I didn't message him either. Maybe it was mutual restraint. Maybe we were both holding space, trying to figure out what line had been crossed and what that meant. Maybe silence was the safest place to retreat when everything suddenly felt more fragile than it looked. But silence has a way of echoing. It was a Thursday when it happened. Late afternoon, sun sharp and unrelenting. I was trimming the garden beds, trying to ignore the humidity settling on my skin, when I heard my name called from the side yard. It was the neighbor, the one from across the street. The one who always trimmed his hedges a little too perfectly. His face was friendly enough, but his eyes lingered. Too long. "You seen that video going around?" he asked. I paused, blinking at him. "What video?" He chuckled, rubbing the back of his neck. Some neighbor's security cam picked up a car behind the Smith's place. Real grainy footage, nothing crazy, but folks online are saying it looks familiar. Small towns, huh? People have too much time. My throat tightened. I forced a smile. I hadn't heard. "Yeah," he said, squinting toward the driveway. Funny how people always recognize cars before faces. He waved and walked off, whistling some tune I didn't recognize. I stood frozen in place, garden shears dangling from my hand, breath shallow. My mind raced. The car. The location. The shed. Had someone filmed it? Had someone posted it? Was it him who had parked too far in the open? I dropped the shears and went inside, hands shaking slightly. My phone was in the kitchen. I picked it up, opened the local community app, and searched. It took only seconds. The video wasn't clear, but it didn't have to be. It showed a car pulling behind the Smith's shed around sunset. No faces. Just shadows. A figure stepping out. A door opening. The glow of a lantern flickering inside. The comments were vague but knowing. "Looks like someone's sneaking around. Is that the Johnson's old shed? Can't mistake that truck." A few laughing emojis. A few comments deleted by moderators. But the implication was there. Clear enough for anyone who wanted to see it. My heart thudded in my chest, steady but too loud. I turned off the screen and placed the phone face down on the counter. My mouth was dry. My hands trembled. He hadn't messaged because maybe he already knew. That evening, my husband came home later than usual. He didn't mention the video. He didn't mention the neighbor. He ate his dinner in quiet, watching some talking head on the television drone about local taxes. He offered me the last piece of bread. I declined. He didn't press. But there was something different in the way he looked at me. Not suspicion. Not anger. Something quieter. Distance, maybe. Or knowing. I lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling. My thoughts swirled, disjointed and half-formed. I kept hearing the neighbor's words, "People always recognize cars before faces." Morning came with thick air and a heavy sky. Rain again. A slow, persistent drizzle that blurred the windows and made the whole world look smudged. I didn't go to the garage. I didn't check my phone. I simply moved through the day, waiting. When the knock came at the back door, it didn't surprise me. I opened it and there he was, standing in the rain, jacket soaked, face unreadable. I stepped aside. He walked in. No words. No hesitation. We sat at the kitchen table, rain tapping softly against the glass. I poured 2 mugs of coffee. Neither of us drank. Finally, he spoke. "I think it's spreading." I nodded. I saw it. People are talking. They are. He looked down at his hands, then back at me. I didn't mean for this to happen like this. I know. We sat in silence for a while. The rain grew louder, drumming against the roof like a distant warning. My throat ached with everything I wanted to say but couldn't. Not yet. He leaned forward, elbows on the table, eyes searching. "Do you regret it?" I looked at him, studied the lines on his face, the weight in his eyes. "No," I said softly. "I don't." He didn't smile. Neither did I. But something passed between us then. Not relief. Not closure. Just truth. Eventually, he stood. I didn't stop him. He walked back into the rain without an umbrella. His shoulders were hunched, his step slow. I watched until he disappeared around the corner. When I turned back inside, the house felt different. The silence was no longer neutral. It was expectant. Something had begun to unravel, and now, it would finish on its own timeline. I sat at the table long after the coffee had gone cold. The rain kept falling. And I waited. The morning after he came to the kitchen, I woke to a peculiar stillness. Not the calm kind, but a kind that felt deliberate. Like the house was holding its breath. I listened for the sounds of my husband in the kitchen, the scrape of his chair, the faint clang of the mug against the counter. But there was nothing. I got up slowly, moved to the doorway, and found the kitchen empty. His thermos was gone. No note. No trace. Only silence. I stared at the place where he usually stood, where routine had etched itself into the floor. I tried to convince myself that nothing was wrong, that maybe he had simply left early. But a knot had begun to tighten in my stomach, low and slow. As I poured a cup of tea, I caught my reflection in the window. My face was pale. Not sickly, just colorless. The skin around my eyes looked tired. The corners of my mouth were tight. I touched my cheek and looked away. The rest of the day passed in fragments. I folded laundry but forgot where I put it. I made lunch and didn't eat it. I checked my phone but didn't know what I was looking for. Messages? Apologies? Warnings? Nothing came. In the afternoon, I ventured into town. I told myself it was to get groceries, but I came back with only bread and dish soap. I walked slowly through the aisles, aware of glances, too polite to be obvious, too frequent to ignore. One woman smiled at me and looked away immediately. A man near the freezer section narrowed his eyes and then said nothing. There was no confrontation, no whisper loud enough to catch. But I felt it. The shift. The judgment creeping into quiet spaces. I felt it settle on my shoulders like an unwelcome coat. By the time I returned home, the air had grown heavier, the light outside dull with the weight of an overcast sky. I stood in the kitchen unpacking groceries and realized I hadn't once thought about dinner. I hadn't once thought about him. My husband. Not since morning. When the front door finally opened, I tensed. His footsteps were slow. He didn't call out. I waited for him to enter the kitchen, but he didn't. I turned toward the hallway and found him standing just outside the archway. His hands were at his sides. His face was still. We stood like that for several seconds, just looking at each other. No words. No movement. Then he spoke. "Do you have anything to tell me?" His voice was low. Not angry. Not cold. But steady. Too steady. My heart dropped. I opened my mouth but hesitated. I felt every version of the truth rise and fight for space. Denial. Justification. Silence. All of it useless. "Yes," I said. He didn't move. Just waited. "I made a mistake," I continued. "And I didn't mean for it to become what it did." He stepped forward, still calm. "Did you lie to me?" I swallowed hard. "Yes. Not directly. But I did." His jaw tensed. His hands curled slightly at his sides. He looked down at the floor, then back up at me. "The video," he said. "I saw it. I wasn't sure at first," he added. "But then I watched it again. And again." There was a pause. "And then I recognized the car. Then I recognized the way you walked." I closed my eyes briefly. Shame rose like a tide inside me. "Why didn't you just tell me?" he asked. His voice cracked, just slightly. "I didn't want to hurt you." "But you did," he said quietly. "You did anyway." I nodded. My hands were cold. For a moment, I thought he would yell. Or cry. Or leave. But he didn't do any of those things. He just stood there, staring at me with a kind of wounded disbelief. "How long?" he asked. I looked down. It wasn't a long time. But it was enough. Silence again. He rubbed his face with both hands, then turned away. He walked into the living room and sat on the couch. I followed slowly, unsure if I should speak, unsure if I had any right. "I didn't plan it," I said, standing behind him. "I didn't go looking for it. It just happened." He let out a soft, bitter laugh. "That's always how it happens, isn't it?" I didn't answer. "I kept thinking you were just distracted," he continued. "That maybe I'd done something. That maybe if I paid more attention, things would go back to normal." "You didn't do anything wrong," I said. "This isn't about you." He looked up at me sharply. "It's not about me?" "I mean, it's not your fault." "Then whose is it?" he asked. "His." "Yours?" "Mine for not noticing?" I sat on the armrest of a nearby chair, keeping my distance. "It's not about fault. It's about what's been missing. What I didn't realize I needed until..." He interrupted. "Until someone else gave it to you." I didn't respond. We stayed there, both frozen in our own corners of the room. The air was thick with all the things we hadn't said for years, small resentments, tiny disappointments, unmet needs. It all poured into the space like smoke, visible now only because the flame had finally gone out. "I don't know what to do now," he said. "Neither do I." He leaned back, closed his eyes. "I thought we were fine. Not perfect, but fine." "So did I," I whispered. That night, we didn't speak again. He slept on the far edge of the bed, facing the wall. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to his breath. I didn't cry. Not because I wasn't sad, but because the sadness had settled too deep for tears. I knew something had broken. Not suddenly. Not loudly. But clearly. And it wasn't just us. It was the idea of who we had been. Of what we had expected from each other. of what we'd quietly accepted as enough. Now, we both had to live with the sound of it breaking. The house felt different in the days that followed. Not dramatically. Not in a way that anyone from the outside might notice. But inside it felt like everything had shifted just slightly out of place, like furniture that had been pushed an inch to the left, not enough to trip over, but enough to feel wrong underfoot. We moved through our routines in silence. Polite, practiced silence. We exchanged necessary words, grocery lists, reminders, the occasional question about dinner, but the warmth was gone. The shared glances had cooled. There were no accusations, no yelling, no slammed doors. Just the slow decay of what once felt like certainty. I found myself avoiding mirrors. Not because I couldn't look myself in the eye, but because I didn't recognize the person who stared back. Not entirely. There was something in her eyes now, a tiredness, yes, but also something firmer. A quiet knowing. She had crossed a line and couldn't go back. She knew that. And yet, she stood anyway. I hadn't seen him again, not since the morning he walked out of my kitchen into the rain. He hadn't called. I hadn't reached out either. We both seemed to understand, without saying so, that there was nothing left to discuss. Not in the way we had before. The space between us now was filled with too much knowing, too much risk. We had already said everything that mattered. The town kept moving. The video faded from conversation, replaced by new distractions, new gossip. People have short attention spans, especially when the truth is quieter than the rumor. But I still felt it sometimes, the subtle shift in tone when someone greeted me, the glance that lasted a little too long. Not everyone had forgotten. But no one was brave enough to bring it up. And I was too tired to pretend I didn't notice. One evening, about a week after the kitchen confrontation, I sat on the back porch, watching the sky go pale with dusk. The garden lights flickered on. The wind stirred the trees just enough to make the leaves whisper. I held a glass of water in my hand, not drinking, just feeling the cool condensation on my palm. My husband came outside and sat beside me. Not too close. Just enough for it to feel intentional. We didn't speak for a while. We just listened to the breeze and the occasional hum of a passing car. And then, without looking at me, he said, "I don't hate you." I didn't reply right away. I wasn't sure I believed him. But the way he said it, softly, with no edge, it didn't sound like a performance. I think part of me wanted to, he continued. When I first saw it. The video. When I put it all together. I wanted to be angry. I thought it would be easier than this. This, I repeated, almost to myself. He nodded. But the truth is, I was angry long before you did anything. I just didn't know how to name it. That surprised me. I turned to look at him, but his eyes were fixed on the horizon. I thought we were fine, I said. Not perfect. But fine. So did I, he answered. But fine isn't always enough, is it? I shook my head. Not for me. I know. We sat for another long stretch, the silence between us no longer brittle but soft, like an old coat pulled from the closet. Familiar. Heavy. Not warm, but not cold either. I keep thinking about everything we didn't say, he murmured. All the ways we drifted. I kept waiting for you to notice, I admitted. I kept assuming you were just tired. I was. He looked at me then. Really looked. There was grief in his face, but not bitterness. Did you love him? The question landed with more quiet than shock. I breathed in slowly. I don't know, I said. Maybe not in the way you mean. But he saw something in me I hadn't seen in a long time. and I held on to it. He nodded slowly. And now? I don't think I ever wanted him instead of you, I said. I just wanted to remember who I was. Before I became invisible. His shoulders dropped slightly. The tension in them had become so constant I hadn't noticed until it began to ease. I should have seen you, he said. Not just looked, but seen. We didn't cry. We didn't hold hands. We didn't say we'd be okay. But in that shared moment, I felt something shift again, not backward, not forward, just a breath released into the open air. A kind of honesty we hadn't shared in years. Later that night, after the dishes were washed and the lights dimmed, I stood at the bedroom mirror and looked at myself. Really looked. Not for flaws. Not for beauty. Just for truth. The woman staring back was not the same woman who had walked into that garage months ago. She had made choices, some painful, some selfish, some necessary. She had felt more than she thought she was allowed to. And she had survived the unraveling of her certainty. She wasn't proud. But she wasn't ashamed. I turned off the light and climbed into bed. My husband lay beside me, turned slightly toward the wall. We didn't speak. We didn't touch. But we slept in the same room. And for now, that was something. In the morning, I would make coffee. I would water the garden. I would move through the world not as who I had been, but as who I had become. Not forgiven. Not forgotten. But real.